Ladies and gentlemen of Tudorcon 2024. Greetings from Tokyo. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you, but of course it's a long wait. I have to say I admire and slightly jealous of you dressing up in all your finery and enjoying the New England weather this month. Okay, I'm here today to talk about my new book, A Gentleman from Japan, the untold story of an incredible journey from Asia to Queen Elizabeth's court. It was out in May of this year. And I think you will see that it is something very different from the normal books about Tudor England in the fact that it's all about Japan and Tudor England. So without ado, I will start my talk now. The date is November 1588, London, England, just after the Spanish Armada has been defeated, and a man described as a gentleman of Japan, whose name was Christopher, attended Queen Elizabeth's court. No Japanese ship had ever navigated outside Asia, and no English ship had yet reached East Asia either. So who was Christopher? How did he come to be in London? This is Christopher's story. You can find it in the book, Gentleman from Japan. It's available in all good bookshops, online, of course, and probably in a local bookshop of yours, certainly for order as well. First of all, although I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Tudor history and background, I'm just going to briefly pull it in here so that we can see how Christopher came to be in England. England had been dreaming of contact with Japan, Cathay, the Indies. They weren't quite sure of the names since at least Columbus's time. Writings from the time present Asian contact as a kind of panacea to the national ills, of which there were plenty at this time. However, every attempt at navigation had failed until, in 1580, Drake reached the Moluccas Islands in modern Indonesia after having crossed the Pacific and on the way back to England on his famous circumnavigation. A few years later, the first embassy from Japan arrived in Europe. It was a Catholic embassy sent by Catholic lords in Japan, and they toured Catholic Europe. Of course, England being England was most definitely not Catholic, and therefore the Tensho embassy, as they're known, did not come to England. This was something of a bugbear for Queen Elizabeth, who really wanted to have her own Japanese embassy touring England. One of her youngest and most ambitious courtiers, a man called Thomas Cavendish, whether he knew it or not, was about to try and remedy the situation. In 1586, July, he departed Plymouth on the first ever planned circumnavigation. All circumnavigations up to this time had been done by mistake. This was the first one to actually be planned. A year later, 1587, November, he meets two boys from Japan, two young men from Japan, and it's recorded in Hakluyt, the great chronicler of English navigations. This is what it has to say. But before his departure, that's Cavendish's departure, he took out of this great ship two young lads born in Japan, which could both read and write their own language. The eldest being about 20 years old, was named Christopher. The other was called Cosmos, about 17 years old, both of very good capacity. So we can see that Cavendish has met or taken out of the ship that he's captured two young Japanese men, literate, very unusual for the time, and of good capacity, intelligent lads. From there, Cavendish carries on his circumnavigation back to England. First of all, of course, crossing the Pacific from the island of California. Yes, in those days, they believed there was an island. They take route through the Philippines, through Guam, through the Philippines, down through Indonesia, around southern Africa, and up the Atlantic to England, where they arrive in Plymouth on September the 9th, 1588. This is a report. We don't have the original English, but this is the French translation. Il a aussi amené avec lui quelques gentilshommes indiens venus commander leur propre mouvement et franche volonté. Cavendish has announced to the world that he has come back, and he's announcing that he's brought gentlemen of the Indies, and they came of their own volition. And the Venetian ambassador to France also adds to this, they came through a desire to meet the Queen. Maybe Queen Elizabeth is going to get her Japanese embassy after all. Gentleman, after all, is, in contemporary terms, in Tudor terms, a very high rank in society. They are the lowest rank of the nobility, but they are still nobility. And therefore, it's quite something to have gentlemen of the Indies coming to London. And from Plymouth, they go round to Greenwich, where they arrive on November the 12th, 1588, just over a month after they've actually arrived in England. And it's reported that Cavendish's ship arrived decked out in blue silk and cloth of gold. Amazing. Extremely luxurious. It must have looked like some kind of godly, divine ship arriving at Greenwich. Queen Elizabeth, whose palace, of course, is at Greenwich, and you can see in this picture, dined aboard 5 days later. This is at the point where Christopher would have met the Queen. There's no definitive record of this, but we know that she wanted to meet Japanese people. We know that they were on the same ship, and this is where it would have happened. However, it was covered up, and we're going to see why in a minute. There's several other records of these Japanese lads being in London at the time. First, from Hakluyt again, is it not strange that the born naturals of Japan are here to be seen agreeing with our climate, speaking our language, and informing us of the state of their eastern habitations? They were clearly one of the focuses of the intelligentsia that month. Another man, a translator and a merchant called Robert Park, who dedicated his book to Cavendish, mentions them also in the foreword to his book. But since it is so, as we understand that your worship, Thomas Cavendish, having brought home 2 young fellows of good capacity, born in the mighty island of Hapon, which hereafter may serve as our interpreters in our first traffic thither, and then carries on from there. We have a good idea here that Christopher and his colleague Cosmas are to be set up as interpreters when Cavendish returns to Japan, which in effect is what this book is announcing. Gentlemen, nobles of the Indies. Let's have a look and see what kind of people actually Christopher and Cosmas, in particular Christopher, who is the oldest and is the one with most records, was. We need to go back to Japan to find out what kind of country they were coming from at the time. Japan in the 16th century was at a brutal civil war. There'd been a total collapse of central government, piracy and banditry were rife, and slaving was common. By the 1580s, when Christopher would have left Japan, thousands of people each year, mainly children, were being trafficked, mainly to other countries in Asia and other cities in Asia, for example, Manila in the Philippines, Macau, Siam, what is now Thailand, and other areas. Christopher and Cosmas, in fact, had been trafficked to Manila. We know that because the ship that they were taken off, which was taken by Cavendish off California, had come from Manila. By the 1580s, Manila and Acapulco were the only cities in Asia and North America connected, and it was the largest route for Asian goods to be transshipped via Mexico to Europe. Okay, we know from this that Christopher is highly unlikely to have been a gentleman. We know that he was a slave, and we know that the Queen had been deceived by Cavendish, essentially. But Christopher, as a slave, though, still has a lot of useful information. And at this point, we see that the English intelligentsia, who continue to interview him, continue to use his intelligence. After all, he's the first ever East Asian that they've ever met, the first ever person from Japan that they've ever met, and he is extremely interesting to them. He's got knowledge and ideas that these people have never come across before. They call them instead, Christopher and Cosmos, naturalists. A naturalist is one of the contemporary words which we would now use as scientist or scholar. Essentially, from being gentlemen, the Elizabethans, very class-conscious people, have decided that they are not gentlemen anymore. They are now scientists, scholars. And here is the first mention of them as scholars by a man called William Barlow, who is a clergyman and a scholar himself. He specifically was a scholar of magnetism, which doesn't sound much, but at the time this was cutting edge technology because navigators needed compasses, and the English compasses of the time were woefully inadequate. Some few years since, says William Barlow, so fell out that I had several conferences with 2 East Indians which were brought into England by Master Cavendish and had learnt our language. One of them was of Manila, in the island of Luzon, the other of Miyako, in Japan. This is Christopher. I questioned them concerning their shipping and manner of sailing. They described all things far different from ours. And it continues on and describes a compass similar to this picture that I have had drawn here. A clay pot with water in and a magnetized fish. The fish is, of course, made of iron. And from the experiment, which is described by Barlow later in his book, he, along with many other references he found and talked to other people, he made this compass. He called it the compass of variation. It was a much, much superior compass to that which the English had had up until then. And in fact, this is the compass which took the first English people to North America. It's the compass which the people on the Mayflower would have used. It's the compass which was used up until probably around the middle of the 17th century, and therefore has a significant place in North American history, as well as in English history, and also, as it happens, has a relation to Japan and the Far East as well. Second remaining source we have of naturalist is from a man called Jacques Carré, Jr. He was originally from what we now call the Netherlands, Holland, but he had been long resident in England, along with his father and I think his brother as well. He writes in a letter, he wrote this in French originally, but I've translated it to English. I had the Indians that Cavendish brought with him here in my house and showed them the star anise, asking what it was. One who came from the Philippines called it Damour. I also asked separately the other Indian who also came from those whereabouts, that means Japan, and he also called it Damour. It is drunk with water, as we do here with anise and water. This, in fact, is star anise, something which is very common in Asian cooking, especially Chinese cooking, but had never been seen in England before. And Jacques Carré, who was an apothecary, was trying to work out what to do with it. He also sent you the word Damour. This is written in the Indian's own hand. This is by Christopher. He wrote starting from the top and then going down, as you'll see from his handwriting. So we can see as a record here that this is the first ever time that an East Asian language has been written in London, in England. And it's written by Christopher, and he was describing the name of star anise in a language. I wasn't able to identify what language Damour actually was. It's certainly not Japanese, but it may be that it had a contemporary word which is lost to history. There are other various technologies and intelligences that Christopher may have contributed to, especially another published chapter in Hakluyt's book entitled The Large Map of China, which was taken back by Cavendish. We can see here what the original Chinese intelligence would have looked like. There was only really one possible person or two possible people on that ship that could have translated the Chinese, which has a deep relation to Japanese, without going into details. It could only really have been Christopher. We can see here the English translation that was published by Hakluyt. The Chinese written here is almost the same as the English, and it's highly, highly likely that Christopher was the man. This map was made by a man called Luo Hongxiang, and this is the map that Cavendish would have brought back. There was also a globe published in the same decade that Christopher was living in England. He left in 1591, and the globe by Emery Molyneux was released to the public a couple of years later, although it's known that he had been making it for many, many years. It so happens that Emery Molyneux is also believed to have been on the ship that Christopher was on to reach London from California. This is the very globe here with the world on it. It's highly likely that Christopher's intelligence was also used by Emery Molyneux to help construct this globe. My time is up, but there's a lot more of the story. What happened next? I'm sorry, I can't speak any more about it today, but if you want to find out more, the book is out. You can look at it. I think there's some pamphlets around at Tudorcon, or you can use this QR code. This QR code will take you to Amazon, but of course there are many, many other bookshops online and in your high streets which will be selling this book as well. Please feel free to buy it anywhere you would like to. Thank you very much for listening. I wish I could answer your questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out online to me, and I look forward to hearing from you. Okay, that's farewell from me. Goodbye.